And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Have you ever wondered how one person's decisions can bring an entire economy to the brink of collapse? Countless industries, thousands of jobs, and billions of dollars are all at risk because of what started as a simple statement about tariffs. Today we'll tell you how the tariff war with Canada, started by Donald Trump, caused a real economic storm that even affected the most ordinary things we buy every day.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
Canada, the U.S.'s largest trading partner, imposed a 25% tariff on several American goods, including American wine. More than 11 million liters of this drink could not be exported outside the country. And if you think these are just numbers, you are wrong. Small wineries, especially in places like Napa Valley, were on the verge of collapse. Contracts worth millions of dollars were cancelled and wine stocks were blocked. 80% of these producers were unable to redirect their products to other markets. But the consequences for the entire industry are not just a loss of profit. We are talking about millions of people whose lives depended on the success of these businesses. Tourism in Napa Valley has also been hit hard, with hotel and restaurant prices rising by 20%, which immediately led to a sharp drop in tourist numbers. But this is only the beginning.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Imagine what happened next. Canadian tariffs hit not only winemakers, but also the U.S. agricultural sector, which has already lost $500 million. And here's the most alarming thing: the construction industry has also suffered huge losses. Steel, aluminum, building materials, all of these have become significantly more expensive. House prices rose by 20%, and almost no new jobs were created.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
But the current situation is not the only threat. If Trump's policy continues, experts warn that an economic downturn may be inevitable. Within a few months, the U.S. could lose its economic stability, and many industries could be on the brink of collapse. No matter how much Trump insists that the situation is under control, the statistics tell a different story. Stocks are falling, the dollar is losing value, and ordinary Americans are seeing their expenses rise every day. But this is only the beginning. Imagine what happened next. Not only did Canada begin to look for alternatives in trade relations, China and India, finding themselves in a situation where the US was no longer such a profitable partner, began to sign major contracts that deprived America of enormous economic privileges. Trump, like a captain who cannot see his ship sinking, continues to insist that everything will be fine. And while he paints a rosy picture, the world around him is changing. Is he capable of saving the US economy, or will the whole world end up in crisis? Stay with us to find out how one mistake could lead to a global economic disaster.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
25%, that was the tariff Canada imposed on several categories of goods imported from the US. This decision was motivated not only by economic but also by political reasons, and it affected a wide range of goods, from agricultural products to wine. Faced with this situation, American companies were confronted with a problem that had a dramatic impact on their profits and stability. However, one of the most serious blows was the ban on wine exports to Canada, a market that accounted for about 18% of all American wine sales abroad. For wine producers in Napa Valley and other parts of California, it was a real nightmare.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
When the tariffs came into effect, wineries found themselves with more than 11 million liters of wine that could not be exported to Canada. These volumes are equivalent to the annual reserves of many small wineries for which the Canadian market was one of the key markets. Warehouses overflowing with product created a huge problem for winemakers who were unlikely to be able to sell these volumes on the US domestic market given the decline in purchasing power and high production costs. Wine producers found themselves in a trap. Contracts worth millions of dollars where Canadian buyers were cancelled, and small wineries, lacking the capacity to repurpose and expand their sales market, were literally on the verge of bankruptcy. Although some large companies were able to redirect their supplies to other markets, most small producers did not have the financial resources to adapt quickly. Moreover, 80% of them did not have the necessary connections to enter other regions, especially in Asia or Europe, which made their situation even more difficult. The export problems were not limited to wine. Agricultural products, including fruits, vegetables, and processed foods, also suffered from tariffs. The Canadian market was important for American farmers, and the loss of this sales channel led to a drop in revenue of tens of millions of dollars. In particular, fruit exports to Canada, which accounted for 25% of all foreign shipments, were threatened. Producers of apples, grapes, and other crops traditionally oriented toward the Canadian market found themselves on the brink of financial collapse, as it was impossible to find alternatives in such a short time. This was followed by job cuts in agriculture and manufacturing, which also affected employment in other sectors of the economy.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
However, one of the most painful blows was the rise in construction material prices. As an important supplier of steel and aluminum to American industry, Canada could not remain on the sidelines of this trade conflict. In response to the tariffs imposed by the US, Canada increased metal prices, which caused a spike in construction costs. For ordinary Americans, this meant higher prices for houses, apartments, and utilities, as well as for repairs and new construction. One of the most striking examples was the rise in house prices in major cities such as Los Angeles and New York, where the cost per square meter increased by 20% in just a few months. This significant increase in housing costs came as a shock to those who were planning to buy their first property, as well as to developers who were unable to offset the rising cost while keeping prices affordable. For the population, this was another milestone in a difficult economic situation, with the dollar losing value and the cost of everyday goods rising.
That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
tariff war with Canada also meant that American consumers began to feel the real impact on their wallets. Products that used to be available at familiar prices now cost significantly more. Wine, steel, aluminum, agricultural products, everything became more expensive. Wines that once cost $15 to $20 now cost $5 to $7 more. Everyday goods such as bread, vegetables, and meat also became significantly more expensive. For millions of Americans, especially those living in small towns where industrial jobs are declining, these price changes have been a real blow to their budgets. With income growth remaining flat and prices rising, many have had to cut back on other important things such as education, health, and leisure. The economy, which was already on the brink of recession, received another serious blow. At the same time, economists warned that if the tariffs were not lifted soon, the losses would only grow. Expectations that the US would be able to quickly recover its economy after the introduction of these measures did not materialize. On the contrary, the threat of recession became a reality. Slowing GDP growth, rising unemployment, and falling purchasing power were clear indicators that Trump's economic model had led to undesirable consequences. Economic growth forecasts for 2025 became increasingly pessimistic, with experts warning that the US could face a deep economic crisis.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Meanwhile, social tensions continued to rise in America itself. Society was divided into two camps: those who supported the president's tough policies and those who criticized him for their economic consequences. Watching the situation unfold, ordinary Americans, who were facing rising prices and job cuts, wondered how long the country could endure such consequences. Amid this tension, Trump continued to defend his policies and claim that they would lead to a better future for the American economy, but with each new step, his confidence began to seem less and less justified. These events are just the beginning of what lies ahead for the US economy in the coming months. Declining confidence in US economic policymakers, the loss of key trading partners, and falling investment pose a real threat to the stability of the entire country. As the economy continued to slide into recession, Donald Trump, despite all the warnings, continued to insist that his economic strategy would lead to the greatest recovery in US history. There was no room for doubt in his public statements. America, he said, was on the path to the greatest economic prosperity, despite all the external signs of crisis. Constant exaggeration and confidence that his tariff and trade policies with other countries were correct created an illusion of stability, but the reality was much more alarming. In the end, it all became not just a question of economics, but a real political and diplomatic crisis.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
After tariffs were imposed on Canadian goods, the US economy became increasingly strained. Despite growing criticism and real economic consequences, Trump continued to insist that this policy had long-term benefits. "We are building America from scratch," he said in his public speeches, ignoring the already obvious losses in the economy. However, alarm began to grow among economists and financial analysts. Signed contracts for the supply of goods and resources were cancelled, and other countries, such as China and India, began to look for alternatives to the US. At that time, Canada, sensing the threat of economic isolation, immediately began to reorient its trade flows. This meant that the US was losing not only an important economic partner, but also a key part of its global economic network. Trump and his administration continued to claim that the world saw the US as a superpower, but in reality, the situation was far from that. Instead of restoring confidence in the American economy, his decisions caused growing discontent among allies and partners. Canada not only reduced its trade with the US, but also signed a contract with China for oil and gas supplies, which significantly weakened America's position on the global stage. China, in turn, did not wait, but immediately began signing new agreements with other countries in an effort to strengthen its economic position. The losses for the US in this context became more than tangible. In the first months of 2025, the US faced a massive exodus of investors from the country. More than $100 billion in long-term bonds were sold, and capital continued to flow out of the American economy. Experts from Goldman Sachs and other major financial institutions began to warn that if Trump's policies did not change, the economic downturn in the US could continue for several more years. Amid this political and economic instability, one thing became clear: the consequences of the tariff war started by Trump affected not only the US but the entire world. The situation forced many countries to rethink their relations with America and look for new ways to cooperate and invest, while American citizens felt the weight of economic policy and saw no signs of improvement. Against the backdrop of all these processes, Trump continued to stick to his guns, insisting that he and his administration were doing everything possible to restore American power. But many around the world and within the US had already begun to understand that his vision of how to make the country great was actually leading it into a deep economic crisis with unpredictable consequences. As the US economy continued to decline, and the world watched America lose its main trading partner in Canada and other countries abandon the US dollar, Donald Trump had one goal: to maintain the image of a strong leader who never gives in or admits defeat. His claims that the economic crisis was just a temporary setback on the road to the greatest economic revival ever became more and more ridiculous with each passing day. Nevertheless, he did not stop. Trump continued to actively appear on the scene, make statements, and convince the public that the crisis was just part of his strategy. He claimed that he and his team were planning a recovery, despite data showing declining production, job losses, and a sharp decline in investment in the country. Against this backdrop, the Trump administration continued to appeal to those who supported his policies. He claimed that his recovery measures would make America great again and that the world would soon see the fruits of his labor. But despite these statements, many world leaders began to express dissatisfaction with his policies. The European Union, China, and many Latin American countries began to publicly state that they did not see the US as a reliable partner ready for fair and honest cooperation. This meant that the US's influence on the world stage continued to decline. But amid all these economic upheavals, Trump continued to view the situation as an internal problem that could only be solved through changes in trade agreements. His view of international trade remained unshakable. He believed that America should earn more and other countries should pay for goods and services that they had previously received at lower tariffs. Trump refused to acknowledge that his tough policies were destroying relations with neighbors and partners, causing even greater discontent both within the US and abroad. Meanwhile, Americans began to realize that Trump's claims of an economic revival were nothing more than superficial promises that could not hide the reality. People saw their own incomes decline and the cost of living rise. Consumers faced higher prices for food, housing, and services, and the American people increasingly wondered why the economy Trump had promised had not lived up to their expectations. In response, many began to look for reasons for what was happening, discussing how effective the current administration's policies really were. At the same time, social media became a powerful tool for spreading discontent among the population. Posts and memes criticizing Trump for his inconsistency and incompetence appeared more and more frequently on the internet. Many people complained about the inability to cope with rising prices and job cuts. While Trump continued to claim that he and his team were doing everything possible to save the economy, ordinary citizens began to doubt his ability to handle the situation. The economic crisis in the US became increasingly apparent, and Trump was increasingly the target of harsh criticism from both experts and ordinary citizens. Meanwhile, other countries around the world began looking for ways to minimize their dependence on the US economy. China signed lucrative trade agreements with neighboring countries. India developed economic cooperation with Europe, and Europe, in turn, sought new trade channels to compensate for the losses from Trump's policies. Canada, as already mentioned, not only signed major contracts with China and India, but also began to strengthen its economic ties with the EU, which was another step towards reducing its economic dependence on the US. This meant that America was losing its key economic levers, and its global influence was shrinking by the day. Thus, Trump was faced with a serious choice: either to revise his economic policy and try to restore trust with his partners, or to continue to persist in his confidence that he was on the right path. However, at the moment when his self-confidence reached its peak, the problems caused by his trade wars became inevitable for the entire global economy. Despite its power, America found itself in global isolation, and the future of its economy depended on the steps Trump would take in the coming months.